A very good evening to you and welcome and thank you for taking the time out of your days and making the time available in your days on what is a fairly warm evening right across Victoria to attend this information session regarding minerals exploration in northeast Victoria. I'd like to start tonight's session by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm coming to you from, which is the Gunai Kurnai people, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And given this is an online session and there's no doubt people joining from probably right across Victoria, if not from other states potentially as well, I encourage you to do the same from wherever you might be beaming in or streaming in from this evening. We've got plenty to get through tonight, and over the course of the next half hour, you'll hear from several of my colleagues that will hopefully provide you with a little bit more knowledge regarding minerals exploration in Victoria, and we hope that you certainly leave tonight's session knowing more than you did when you joined it just now. So over the course of the next half hour, you'll hear from Ross Cayley, who's a senior geologist with the Geological Survey of Victoria, who will provide some information about the geology of northeast Victoria and the history of minerals exploration in the region. Given some of the recent interest from explorers in the region, you're probably wondering, well, why is it that they're looking for or interested in applying for an exploration licence in this part of the state and potentially undertaking exploration activities there? And Ross will certainly more than enlighten you on that point. You'll then hear from Laura Helm from Earth Resources Regulation, who will provide information about the regulation of minerals exploration in Victoria and the licensing process for minerals exploration. And then I'll briefly touch on some of the tools that are available to support landholders during minerals exploration, particularly in the event that you might be approached by an explorer who might want to undertake exploration activity on your property. We should have that all wrapped up by about 7:35, 7:40ish, and then we'll take questions with a view to finishing somewhere around 8 o'clock. Now, I will stress that that is not a hard finish time, and we're all happy to remain as long as there's questions coming in, and we'll do our best and endeavour to answer as many of those as we can. In terms of questions, there was an opportunity to submit some with the registrations, and we did have a number of those come in, which we'll tackle first up out of the presentations, and then we'll get to some that inevitably will come in over the course of the next half hour or so as we get through the presentations, which probably leaves you wondering, well, how do you ask a question? This is a live Teams event, and while we can't see you, there is an opportunity in the chat function to ask questions. So you should be able to see those two little speech bubbles there that I'm just hovering my mouse over. If you click that, it should open up the chat function within Microsoft Teams, and you can type your question in there, and we'll monitor those throughout the night and look to answer as many of those as we can once the presentations are over. If we've learnt one thing over the last 12 months, that technology is great when it works, but it can pose its challenges when it decides not to play ball, and my colleague John Amongan is available and on standby to provide technical support that you may need if you can't seem to access the stream tonight, if you're having difficulty asking a question, if you're having challenges, her number should be up on your screens there, and please don't hesitate to give her a buzz if you've got any questions. I should also stress that we'll look to provide we will be providing written responses to all the questions received tonight following the session within the next couple of weeks, and that a recording will be made available of the session on the Earth Resources website in the days following, and we'll certainly circulate that link to participants in post this session. But that's really it from me on the housekeeping front, and I would now like to hand over to Ross Cayley from the Geological Survey of Victoria, and welcome, Ross.
Thank you, Brett. So as Brett mentioned, I'm a senior geologist who works for the Victorian Government, and basically I'm a research scientist, and my job and the job of the team I'm in is to try and understand Victoria's geology as best as possible. So this is the talk outline I'm going to talk about over the next 15 minutes or so. So I'll start off by giving a little bit more detail of the business group in government that I work in, the Geological Survey of Victoria, and I'll start touching on the questions that I'm sure everybody has tuned in to get some answers on. So why the current mineral exploration interest in northeastern Victoria? What is mineral exploration and how is it done? And probably the big punch question, will there be a mine? And if so, what type might it be? So let's move on. And it's being a little bit slow, but hopefully I'll get a result in a minute. There we go. Let's kick off with who is the Geological Survey of Victoria? Well, it's the Victorian Government's Geoscience Agency, and it's responsible and tasked with understanding the state's geology. And we do that by undertaking geological mapping. We make maps of the different rock types across the state. We do broader scale and more technical geoscientific investigations, and we collect, collate and analyse all this data and other people's data and geoscience knowledge for the whole states with universities and industry and other academia to try and have the best understanding we can of the state's geology. And we provide that information as an evidence base to government and industry and academia. And the purpose for this is to try and support the most informed and responsible management of the state-owned resources that we can. Now, the reason I'm saying state-owned resources is because in Australian law and in Victorian law, the Crown owns the minerals of the state. So the Crown owns them collectively on behalf of all of us. And so because of that, it's incumbent upon government to have an understanding of the asset that they own, so the most informed and responsible use can be made of it. Now, we're all public servants, we're paid for by your taxes, so the work we do and the understanding we have is all available to everyone, for everyone to use, and it can be accessed and viewed online. And I'll show you how to do that in the course of this talk as well for people who are interested in chasing up more information. So let's jump straight into the more technical aspects of the talk. Why the current mineral exploration interest in northeastern Victoria. And what seems to have kicked off the recent round of interest is the application of two recent exploration licenses that have been applied for. Just bear with me while my computer decides what to do. This is frustrating when this happens. Here we go. So these are the two areas in question. One area is between Brighton and Harriettville, and another area is Myrtleford, Beechworth and Yackandandah. And these are two area exploration licence applications that are currently registered in the department. Now, the thing about these two licences is this is not an unusual development in Victoria, and it's not unusual in Eastern Victoria either, including in this district. And I'll talk about that a little bit more further on in the talk. And the reason it's not unusual is because the mineral exploration interest in this part of the world has always been there. So the bedrock geology of the region of northeastern Victoria that we're talking about today is sandstone, ancient sandstone and slate geology that's exactly the same as the rocks that host the world-class goldfields at Bendigo, Ballarat and Castlemaine. All the local towns, Beechworth, Myrtleford, Bright, Harriettville, these towns all started because of the 1850s gold rushes. So gold was discovered, the population swelled enormously and towns were formed. So northeastern Victoria's got proven gold discovery, it's got currently active operating gold mines, and it's obviously also got a proven potential for additional gold discovery, and I'll touch on that a little bit later in the talk. And not just gold necessarily, potentially for some other metals as well, including strategic metals. Let's just step back a little bit to a slightly bigger scale to look at Victorian gold and why explorers are interested in it. So Victoria gold is in two main centres. One is in Western Victoria, and this part of Victoria is truly world class. These gold fields are the equal of any goldfields in Australia. Only the famous orogenic goldfields of Western Australia come close. They're certainly bigger than any other orogenic goldfields in the whole of Eastern Australia. In northeastern Victoria, there are some large goldfields that are the equal of anywhere else in Eastern Australia, but they're not quite as big so far as we know as the Western Victorian ones. Just to talk about the reason why this is significant, let's zoom in a little bit to Victoria. And this is a geology map of Victoria at that sort of broad scale. A few statistics. The amount of gold that's been mined in the whole of human history that's been recorded since before Egyptian times is about 200,000 tonnes. It's actually not that much because gold is so rare. Now, of that total all-time component, Victoria's recorded gold production is a bit over 2,500 tonnes, possibly a little bit more than that. So that's 1.5% of the total all-time world gold production from just 0.15% of the global land area. And in fact, the Victorian goldfields themselves are just a small percentage of Victoria. So they only occupy just 0.03% of the global land area. And what that means is Victoria's goldfields geology, including northeastern Victoria, is 100 times richer in gold production than the average continental crustal average across the world. So you can see why it's so interesting to explorers. It's got so much gold. It's a globally significant area to find and recover gold. Of course, this is the bit we're talking about today. Not the biggest known gold deposits in the state, but still very significant. This is the Victorian Government's Earth Resource portal that everybody can jump onto and have a look at all the geoscience and geology and exploration license data sets online for free. It's called GeoVic. So this is a front page just showing the regional geology. And obviously today we're just going to really talk about this bit of Victoria from now on. This is the area of interest. So let's zoom in on the geology there in the portal. And here's the geology more zoomed in. You can see a lot of different colours there. Those different colours represent different sorts of rocks. And the oldest rocks are the blue and purple rocks that are sort of striped and trending north, west, southeast. So they're the original bedrock of the state, formed between 500 and 450 million years ago. And at that time, gold was introduced into those rocks. Subsequent to that, other rocks have been emplaced. So granite rocks like Mount Buffalo, they're coloured in red. And then the younger, much younger rocks of the Murray Basin sitting on top, they're the yellow rocks. Now, why I'm showing this geology is to show you that mineral explorers have always been interested in exploring for the minerals that these rock types contain. And since the early 1960s, all exploration licence and mining licence applications and activities have been recorded in a government database and are all available on GeoVic. If we switch all those on, you'll get a bit of a feel for the sort of work that's been done in the past. There's literally been hundreds of exploration licences taken out over the last 50 years or so, looking for minerals in various places with varying degrees of success. Now, you can see some of those, the red polygons are open and some of them are coloured in purple. So the reason I'm showing you the coloured in purple ones is because these are the mineral exploration and mining licenses that are active right now as of the 1st of February this year. So you can see that much of northeastern Victoria is already under active mineral exploration licenses. And the two ones that have caught people's attention in December are these two here. And you can see they're sort of really quite small in the overall larger scheme of things. Just a couple of extra ones tacked onto an area that is already comprehensively covered by active mineral exploration licenses. So in lots of ways, this is business as usual for northeastern Victoria, but sometimes individual applications catch people's attention. So we understand the interest. If we look at all the mineral exploration licenses that have ever been done, you can do a data search on these and just download them into a table and see what's happened. And so this gives you information about the name of the person who took out the license, what they were looking for, where the license was, how long they had it, what they discovered, was it successful, all that sort of stuff, when it was relinquished. So a lot of these licenses have been let go because they didn't find anything economic, and some of them continue because they did. The reason for the coverage that's looking pretty comprehensive over the area at the moment is because mineral explorers have a new appreciation of the size of the prize available potentially in Victoria, and that relates to a gold mine near Fosterville, near Bendigo in Western Victoria. So let's have a look at Fosterville. This is where Fosterville is. It's sitting in the middle of the classic sort of Golden Triangle goldfields, just a short distance east of Bendigo. Here's a table from 2017 showing significant drill intersections in the whole world for any metal for 2017. And Fosterville, the gold deposit, makes ahead of that list because it was literally the world's best result for 2017. And they got that by drilling through a deposit that went 15 metres width, so about as wide as a sort of moderate sized house, at 1,500 grams per tonne gold, so 1.5 kilograms of gold per tonne. Now, that's a lot of gold because that's not what normally happens with gold. And this is what a gold deposit like that looks like. It's a quartz reef literally studded with gold. And so they've started mining that deposit. It's got millions of ounces of gold at these sorts of grades. And that has resulted in Fosterville being the highest grade and most profitable gold mine in the world. And that happened in 2019 and it happened in 2020. And this headline is from 2020. This is the sort of thing that gold mineral explorers are really looking for. And there is some hint that the geology that hosts the rocks at Fosterville continue into northeastern Victoria, and that's more recent work I'll talk about in a minute. Now, coincident with having a fantastic find and potential for gold in Victoria, international gold price is at historic highs, and that's because demand is at historic highs. So here's the gold price. You can see the current gold price, end of 2020, it's not as high as it has ever been, but it's very close. And it's also been quite stable over the course of about 10 years, and it's been gradually climbing. Now, one of the reasons for that is that gold demand is at historic highs, including for the use in building modern electronics and modern technology. So these are the sorts of things that make our everyday lives work these days. The computer, the device you're watching this talk on, renewable energy like the wind turbine sitting in the background, these are all enabled by the electronics that heavily relies on gold. And that's driving gold demand, for example, in the US up there, up towards 40–50% of total use of gold. And this gold has to come from somewhere, and Victoria is a really good place to get it. So that's where some of the interest is coming from. It's going to be sustained interest. Now, we're interested in trying to garner as much wealth and prosperity for Victorians from this opportunity as we can. And there's a gold royalty, for example, so that gold production in the state these days pays a lot of tax into the state coffers. And so to try and understand this and allow explorers to be as targeted and as efficient as possible and operate with as small a footprint as possible, we constantly do new geoscience and there's new exploration technology as well. And these things open up new opportunities and they allow for more focused and efficient exploration effort. And so, for example, we have better geological understanding. So we have enhanced maps with mineral systems models that allow us to predict where these deposits might be a little better than we have in the past. And then explorers can go searching for them using much lower impact techniques than they have in the past. For example, real-time non-destructive chemical analysis using portable handheld XRF machines, for example. In the past, you'd have to collect a sample and send it away to a laboratory. These days, you can point an XRF gun at it for a minute and get a reading of 60 elements or so. In the past, if you wanted to do airborne surveys, you'd be commissioning a plane. These days, you can often do it by drone, which is obviously quicker and cheaper and has much less environmental impact as well. In terms of geological understanding, we've got concepts, for example, like the idea that some of the central Victorian rocks have been folded around a giant fold, and so they repeat themselves in eastern Victoria. Obviously, big implications for New South Wales geology as well. We all work collaboratively on these sorts of ideas. You can see the obvious implications once you understand where Fosterville fits into this picture. These are the sorts of things that are capturing industry interest. Now, just to have a little bit of a geology 101, so we sort of have the basic elements of the different techniques and historical and modern techniques down pat. This is a sort of schematic cross-section of an area that is very similar to the situation in northeastern Victoria with an old bedrock containing primary gold in quartz veins hidden in the rock that's being uplifted into a mountainous terrain. And when that happens, some of those primary gold-bearing structures end up being eroded where they reach the surface. And where they get eroded, the gold becomes released. And one of the properties of gold is it doesn't rust and it doesn't get transported because it's so heavy. So instead, what happens with that gold is that small particles of it get dragged down under gravity and get redeposited as a secondary deposit in the adjacent riverbed. And once they're in a secondary deposit, they become really easy to find. So people who were illiterate could find these deposits just by panning for gold. And indeed, that's exactly what they did. They panned their way up the creeks, and if they found gold, suddenly they were able to start getting stuck into finding some gold. And back in the 1850s, they initially did it with panning, and then they started to industrialise the process. So they started sluicing at a larger scale, did a lot of environmental damage in the Buckland Valley, for example, and then they further industrialised it with large dredges, and this was one that was operating near Harriettville up into the 1950s. Mineral explorers and miners don't use these techniques anymore. They've got large environmental cost, but also a lot of these deposits have become depleted. When alluvial deposits become depleted, there is a way of finding more, and the way of finding more is to try and work out where those secondary deposits have come from. And the way to do this is to chase the particles of gold up the hill until the point where they stop occurring. And at that point, you know they're being shed out of the adjacent bedrock. And so you can look down, try and find the structures the primary gold is in and get stuck into those. And of course, to mine those, you end up having to chase those narrow, deeply tapped deposits underground. And that's exactly what happened in northeastern Victoria. So for example, this is a cross-section of the Shamrock Reef mine that was operating near Harrietville, an underground mine accessed by an adit, and then they chase these mineralised structures down deeper and deeper underground looking for gold. And in Victoria today, those underground techniques that were small scale in the 1850s are now used at a larger scale to deeper depths in all the current mines operating in Victoria today. So for example, this is the Ballarat mine, a gold mine operating over 600 metres directly beneath the Ballarat CBD right now. So it's an operation that everybody's living on top of. No one's even really aware of it, but it's down there over half a kilometre below the surface mining gold and paying taxes today. In terms of thinking about these deposits, finding surface gold deposits is relatively easy. The gold is there to be found. However, finding the next generation of deposits, and Fosterville is an example of one of those, completely buried and blind to the surface, these are very hard because you have to be able to predict them, and that requires modern geoscience. One of the benefits of looking for primary deposits, though, is that they're hosted in these older consolidated bedrock rocks, and these rocks are impermeable. They do not contain a groundwater resource. So when you're exploring into them, there's a very negligible risk for any sort of damage to groundwater because there literally is virtually no groundwater in those rocks. In contrast, the secondary older style of alluvial deposits, they were in the near surface porous rocks that contained really important groundwater resources, and we wouldn't allow the sort of exploration that was done in the past to damage those resources today. So now on to mineral exploration. What is it and how is it done? Well, really, it's just a systematic investigation of the mineral potential of an area of ground. And it typically involved a new exploration idea. So we've all seen the maps that show there's been generations of different exploration licenses over northeastern Victoria. The thing is, though, most of those were not necessarily done very efficiently. And geoscience, like all sciences, continues to progress through time. As understanding grows, new opportunities emerge. And so it is possible to look through the work that's been done in an area and realise and recognise that actually the techniques to find these modern buried style of gold deposits probably haven't been used very effectively. And that's called a gap analysis, working out what is the gap between the potential for the work that's been done and the work that would need to be done to have a possibility of success. Once you have worked out a gap analysis, you can start deploying some investigation techniques to try and test your ideas. And this is really what mineral exploration is, just testing ideas to see if something might be there. And so it normally has a series of steps, and it starts off with a desktop study where you analyse all the legacy data and work out what's been done before, what new opportunities may remain. And then it moves on to early reconnaissance style investigations, and that often involves undertaking a more modern round of geological mapping. It would be geoscientists on foot walking around looking at rocks, perhaps acquiring more modern geophysics. And as I mentioned before, modern technology is much lower impact than it was in the past. A lot of it can be done using a drone-based operations, for example, acquiring reconnaissance geochemistry, and maybe some reconnaissance rock sampling traverses as well for more detailed analysis off-site. This sort of exploration used to include drill traverses. It's much less common now due to technology advance. Stage 3 normally happens only if the mineral exploration license starts to zero in on something that looks like it really has promise. And when that happens, you just double down on the technique and the area in greater detail. So do more detailed geological mapping, more detailed geophysics, more detailed geochemistry, more detailed sampling. And as you do these cycles of testing and zero in, if you eventually find something that looks good, drilling will probably then be needed to understand it better. And drilling is almost always needed to demonstrate that a mineral resource is economic and to define the size and nature of a mineral resource. Getting near the end now. The last bit, will there be a mine? If so, what type might it be? The most common outcome of a mineral exploration licence in northeastern Victoria and the rest of Victoria actually is that no economic mineral discovery is made, and so the exploration licence is relinquished and the ground sort of waits for another day and someone else's new idea. And the statistics are pretty tricky on this. It's a pretty risky activity, mineral exploration licensing and searching. Being a mineral explorer is pretty risky. Less than 1% of all mineral exploration licenses awarded in Victoria ever progress to a mining licence. So 99% of them don't even find a potential resource that's economic. Assuming a mineral discovery here is made, based on the current knowledge of the geology, the most likely mineral resource that might be discovered would be a high-grade primary reef-hosted gold resource. And in northeastern Victoria, these are always narrow and deeply rooted, and so they're extracted using underground mining methods. So there are some current gold mines operating in the district, and they're all small underground mines with quite small footprints. you're probably unaware of them. For example, you drive right past one when you drive up to Mount Hotham from Harriettville. Gold mines currently operating elsewhere in Victoria, also all underground operations. Historic mining operations in the district were for primary gold underground and secondary alluvial, but only primary gold is considered economically viable today. So that's it. Thank you, Brett. I have relinquished control and I will now be quiet for a while.
Thanks, Ross. You're a wealth of information on all things geology in Victoria, and I'm sure for many of you there's plenty of really interesting insights and information and statistics that Ross has just presented there in the last 20 minutes or so that you might like to go back to and revisit. And I just want to, I guess, make the point again that a recording of tonight's presentation will be made available online after in the coming days, so you will have the opportunity to go back and revisit that. I'd now like to introduce Laura Helm, who's the Director of Statutory Authorisations within Earth Resources Regulation, who will provide a bit more information around the regulation of minerals exploration in Victoria and the exploration licensing process. So welcome to you, Laura.
Hi, so as Brett said, my name's Laura Helm and I'm a Director in Earth Resources Regulation. I am responsible for the approvals area, statutory authorisations. So that includes the work plan assessments and the licensing area, as well as native title and some other areas that support that. So I'm going to talk to you about what is Earth Resources Regulation, how is minerals exploration regulated, and so about what safeguards are in place. And then I'm going to talk to you about where exploration is allowed and about the actual license process. Then we're going to go and walk through some of the applications that I know you're interested in tonight, and just give you an overview of where they're at in that process, and also explain the advertising and public comment process, so how you can have your say, before I wrap up with a bit of information about obligations around community, obligations on explorers and their responsibilities. So hopefully this will catch up with us in a second, but first of all, what is Earth Resources Regulation? So we are a branch within the Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions, and we're responsible for regulating mining, quarrying, exploration, petroleum, and other earth resource activities. So that includes a number of different roles, which go from allocating resources to the Crown-owned resources, so allocating rights, I should say. So that is something that we're talking about tonight. So that's the licensing process. But we also are responsible for protecting a range of things and ensuring that these activities are done safely. So that's about protecting people, land, infrastructure, and the environment. And we do that through a range of things, through approvals, also through setting codes of practice that need to be complied with, but also in compliance activities. Just waiting for the slides to move on here. Doesn't seem to be catching up. Okay. Here we go. Hopefully it won't skip ahead too much there. Okay, so how is minerals exploration regulated? So you've heard from Ross about what the activities are, but I guess part of that was about the fact that any groundworks that were happening are targeted. So first of all, exploration for minerals can only be done if you have an exploration licence. So those licence areas can be quite large, but the actual groundwork or work that's done on the ground will be very small in comparison to the whole area of the licence. So a lot of the work that's done is desktop, and it can be done in relation to the whole of the licence area, but then the more targeted activities would be then the on-ground activities. So Most exploration work is done under a code of practice, and that's where it meets the definition of low impact exploration. So that code of practice is available on our website and is something that you can have a look at for more detailed information. But really importantly, mining can only be done under a mining license or a prospecting license. So even if an explorer finds minerals, they are not able to mine those minerals under an exploration license. So they're not able to extract them. So exploration, you've heard from Ross, is mostly low impact. And you've heard from Ross about some of the types of activities that will occur, so ground mapping, surveying, and so forth. Those can be done under the code of practice. And the code of practice sets out a range of practices that need to be complied with in relation to how that's done. Now, higher impact activities require what's called an approved work plan. So some of those activities will be if you're going to have impacts on a listed species, or where you're proposing to remove native vegetation that are above specified limits, or if you're proposing to drill within 200 metres of a waterway. So in terms of that work plan application process, there are detailed requirements around identifying hazards that might be posed from your activities, risks that might arise to people, land, the environment and infrastructure. And then importantly, you need to demonstrate how you're going to mitigate those risks and that you can eliminate them or reduce them as low as reasonably practicable. Now, those work plans, they are referred across government to other departments who have expertise or regulatory responsibilities for different elements that might be affected by what is being proposed. So often the work plan is referred to the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, or the Catchment Management Authority, or the Water Authority, or a range of other interested government departments. So they will have input and comment into what's in that work plan. So just a little bit more in terms of the regulatory framework that explorers must comply with. So the legislation that Earth Resources Regulation is predominantly charged with regulating under is the Mineral Resources Sustainable Development Act and the regulations that are made under that act. But there are a whole range of other acts that also apply and that explorers must comply with. So there's over 20 pieces listed here, but some of the key ones include Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act. There's the Traditional Owners Settlement Act, Aboriginal Heritage Act, Native Title, Wildlife Act. All of these things need to be complied with as well. So where is exploration allowed? I've already said that it can only be done within a licence, but exploration is allowed on freehold land and on Crown land, except where it's exempted. So Crown land can include places like state forests, and in cases where exploration is allowed, then the explorer must notify the Crown land manager before commencing any ground intrusive work, so before starting work on the ground. But there are also areas that are restricted Crown land where exploration can occur under a licence, but consent is needed from the Crown land manager. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in response to one of the questions that we've received. But exploration and mining are also prohibited in a range of areas. So a licence cannot even be granted in relation to those areas. So those include state parks, national parks and wilderness areas, and a number of other areas that are defined in the Act. And there's also provision in the Act for exempting particular areas. And again, I'll talk a bit more about that in relation to one of the questions at the end. But all of the areas that are available can be seen either on the GeoVic mapping tool that Ross showed you before, but also on our website there's an application called Mining Licenses Near Me, where you can see all of this. So just to talk to you through the exploration licence process, which as you can see is quite a lengthy one. So in the first instance, the application is received by Earth Resources Regulation. So the first step is identifying that it's a valid application, and that's in accordance with their provisions under the legislation and the regulations. Now, sometimes we receive what are called competing applications. So that means 2 applications have been received on the same day, or more than 2, and those need to be ranked in terms of what is given the highest ranking will be the application that will best meet the objectives of the Act in terms of its work program and whether it is likely to find minerals in terms of what they're proposing. So once that stage is passed and there's a highest ranked application, or there's 1 application, then that application is formally accepted under the Act. Now that acceptance phase is then what triggers the advertising requirements that trigger the public comment period. So the advertising I'll talk about in a moment in terms of what that needs to include, but that 3-week public comment period is then the opportunity for community to make objections or comments in relation to the licence application. Now, after the public comment period, there's native title phase needs to be considered, and this will apply if there's Crown land within the application area. So if there's no Crown land, this doesn't apply. But a Future Act assessment is undertaken within Earth Resources Regulation, and that considers what native title procedures might apply. So it may be that the Traditional Owners Settlement Act applies and there's a land use activity agreement in place. So that applies in the Taungurung area. That's part of the area on the mapping that we'll show you in a moment, that those would apply. Or there may be a native title party with a determination, in which case the explorer will be required to negotiate with that party, or otherwise the application will be advertised in accordance with the Native Title Act as a future act, and that provides the opportunity for a native title claim to be brought forward, and if that happens, there's a process that happens under the Native Title Act in relation to negotiating an agreement there. Now, from all those things I've described to you, that can be quite a period of time that can occur between that being finalised. So we often see that it can take between 6 and 18 months in that native title phase, which means that the time between an application being publicly advertised and there being opportunity for community input to the application to the time that it actually comes in to Earth Resources Regulation for assessment, so that's on a decision as to whether the licence should be granted, that can be quite significant, 6, 8, 18, sometimes more. So in terms of that EIR assessment, there's a range of criteria in the legislation. So some of these things I've outlined here. One of them is that the licence applicant must be a fit and proper person to hold a licence. Now, if that's a company, that will mean doing checks against the directors of the company and their associates, or it can be a real person. But things that are done include police checks, but also bankruptcy searches, administration, whether there's been receivership, things that relate potentially to the professional character and conduct of the applicants. Now, we have a fit and proper person policy on the Earth Resources website that outlines all the factors that we consider in relation to that criteria. The next thing that we look at is whether the applicant has has an intention to comply with the Act. Now, one of the key things that we look at here is whether they have existing licenses and what their compliance history is. So we can look at things like whether they've spent the money that they have been required to spend, or we can look at their actual record in terms of any groundworks they've done, any rehabilitation they have done or not done, and that will be taken into account. They also must have an appropriate work program and a genuine intention to do that work. And part of that's about having the relevant technical expertise And they also must be likely to be able to finance the work and, importantly, the rehabilitation. So we do checks to ensure that their companies actually have enough money to do the work they say they're going to do and to also rehabilitate the land when they've done that work. So if there's a decision then made that a licence will be granted, that can be granted for up to 5 years initially, and it can be renewed. So initially there's one renewal and then a further renewal in exceptional circumstances. So a licensee may have a licence for between 5 and up to 15 years. That's an exploration licence. And that licence can have conditions. They have standard conditions, and those standard conditions relate to a range of things, so environmental safeguards, rehabilitation obligations, public liability insurance, funding the program, and a duty to consult with the community. But there can also be special conditions, and I'll talk a bit more about that, but that can arise as a result of the public comment and objection period is one of the ways that that can come through, or also consultation and referrals that we do, for example, with the Crown Land Minister. So those conditions must be complied with for the duration of the licence. Now here's a map that you've seen another version of from Ross earlier, but this sort of shows the range of existing licences and applications across the northeast. So as you can see, there's quite a significant number of licences that are already there, but then also a significant number that are in application phase. So just to give you an overview, and I won't go through this in detail, but it will be available when this is put on our website. These are the whole range of applications that are actually in the application phase. And you can see here in terms of the steps where it's at, number 5 in that table indicates native title phase. So actually majority of these applications are currently in the native title phase. So they've previously been advertised and there's been a public comment period, and this table indicates when that was. So some of it dates back sort of 18 months or more now. So just in terms of those advertising requirements, the legislation and regs require that the applications be advertised in accordance with advertising guidelines. Now, these require statewide and locally circulating newspapers to be advertised in. And last year we introduced new guidelines in response to changes to the local circulating newspapers. There was a number that closed. So if there's no paper, then there are 2 other options that exploration companies can do. They can notify landholders directly within the application area, or they can erect road signs in accordance with the guidelines, and there's a process around that. Now, the licenses open for public comment are also now listed on the Earth Resources website. So when you go in there, there's a table and it will show you all the licenses currently open for comment, have information about their location, links to further information, and when the public comment period closes. And also you can link through to actually make your objection or comment directly through that website as well. So under the legislation, all objections or comments must be in writing. They must include the grounds on which that comment or objection is made, and they must be lodged within 21 days of the last advertising date. So that does mean that in terms of the advertising and public comment period for all of those licenses that I listed on the previous slide, they have gone through that process already, and that is the opportunity for public comment has now closed on all of those. But I guess what an important thing there is that there is a duty to consult on companies in terms of if they are granted that license. So That means that they must consult throughout the licence and share information with community about what they're proposing to do, if it might impact them, and they must give community the opportunity to express views about proposed activities. So that might relate to anything from the hours that are proposed, the location, and other things. So we really would encourage you, if you have concerns in the first instance about something that you see or you're unsure, to contact the companies. So you can look up the information through that mining licenses near me to find details of which companies are operating in which areas, and you'll be able to contact them directly. Now, I'm going to hand over to Brett now, but I will be answering some more of your questions in a moment.
Thanks for that, Laura. I'm just going to talk very briefly before we get to questions around the tools that are available to support landholders in the event that they might be approached by an explorer looking to undertake minerals exploration on their property. Now, Ross sort of flagged earlier that minerals exploration is very targeted in nature, and often it's only a small number of landholders that will be approached by an explorer looking to access their property to undertake such work. A license, a minerals exploration license, does give the explorer the right, obviously, to search for minerals within the license area, and that extends over both freehold land as well as Crown land. Now, in 2017, I'll just switch over here. In 2017, the Victorian government created a guide to help landholders and explorers reach an agreement for access to private property to undertake exploration activities. Now, we recognise that minerals exploration and land access consent is not core business for farmers and agricultural landholders, and so we wanted to develop something that would provide some support to them as if they are approached by an exploration company, in having those discussions with them about land access consent, and thus that's where this land access consent agreement was born from. It includes a checklist for landholders and explorers about how to complete the agreement, and essentially covers a number of factors, including access to the land and the conditions that might be associated with that access, compensation for that access if it's applicable, and dispute resolution mechanisms. But the point that's really worth stressing here is that it's very much a flexible agreement. You don't have to use this. It serves, I guess, a starting point and a conversation starter. You can choose to use this. You might also find that the explorer has their own land access agreement that may work better for you, or you may wish to develop something yourself. It's really important that, I guess, whatever the format that you ultimately choose to use, that it's tailored to your particular circumstances and the particular operations that occur on your property and what might be occurring there. So these are just some of the, I guess, points of consideration that are worth sort of thinking about if you do find yourself approached by an explorer looking to undertake activity on your property, and that includes things like operating hours. So depending on what sort of agricultural operation you might be running, it might be critical to you that the explorer doesn't access the property at certain times of the day. There might be particular access routes that you do or don't want them using. There may be special conditions around biosecurity that you would like built into the agreement, and that's where that consent agreement really sort of comes into play, and it's really important that you document that within that. So it's a free tool that's freely available on our website, and in the information that is provided in the coming days after this session to those that have registered, you will receive a link to access that tool, and would certainly encourage you to, if you are interested, to mull it over and have a bit of a look over it. And so that brings us to the end of the formal presentations for this evening, and it's really now a chance for us to go into the questions. I noticed there are some that have come in on the chat, and we will get to those shortly, but we might start with some of the ones that have come in with the pre-registrations. And I'm going to start with Laura Helm with this first question regarding what are the Victorian criteria for the type of land or land usage where minerals exploration licences would not be granted, i.e. would a mining or minerals exploration licence be granted for Carlton Gardens in Melbourne, and if not, why?
Thanks, Brett. So the Mineral Resources Act exempts a range of classes of public land from licences. So that I've already outlined includes national parks and state parks and a number of other areas. Now, the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, on advice from another body called the Victorian Environment Assessment Council, is responsible for public land classification. So there's a separate process that happens there in terms of what then becomes land that's exempt under those provisions. But the Mineral Resources Act also provides additional safeguards for work on restricted Crown land. So that's a whole range of other types of classes of public land, which might be regional parks, bushland reserves and historic reserves, and a whole range of other similar places. Now, the consent must be obtained from the Crown Land Manager before works can take place, and those are usually quite detailed consent in terms of what can and cannot be done, or in fact may mean that work can't be done. So the licence would exist over the area, but the work would be restricted. Now, the Mineral Resources Act also provides a mechanism to exempt particular areas on a case-by-case basis. Now, that provision needs to take into account a range of things, but that includes the relative geological prospectivity of the area and also other social, economic and environmental factors and values. So this can be done for the orderly development of resources. So that means a tender process for licences, and that's been done in recent years in a couple of areas, so including the North Central Goldfields. But there are also other recent examples where it's been done to exempt areas such as the You Yangs Regional Park and also the Mitchell River floodplain. So those areas have been exempted from licences. So in terms of the Melbourne CBD, it is not exempt from a licence. So in theory, someone could come forward and apply for an exploration licence over Melbourne. But in practice, and perhaps I'm not the best one to speak to this, Ross might be able to, but the actual geological prospectivity of Melbourne is such that that would be extremely unlikely.
Thanks, Laura. Next one is over to you, Ross, and as I switch this over here. What equipment and vehicles are used during exploration? Is there loud noise from machines, and how close to homes are explorers allowed to operate?
Oh, thanks, Brett. Yep, I answered that one. So as I mentioned in my talk, mineral exploration on ground sort of goes through a series of cycles, and those cycles typically begin with geological mapping and analysis, and this typically just involves people driving around on the local road network and then getting out on foot to walk in, study and analyse rocks in situ, and occasionally take small hand-sized samples for further analysis. And those sorts of operations, and often that's the first year or so of an exploration licence, those sorts of operations are sort of virtually impossible to notice, and they cause really no amenity disturbance. On the occasion that companies decide they want to acquire airborne geophysics, if they decide to use that using a manned aircraft, that would involve a single aircraft making repeated low-level traverses in a grid pattern over an area of interest over the course of a day or two. And of course, those sorts of operations will have the noise impact that's comparable to any other sort of similar aircraft-related activity like crop dusting or something, but it would last for potentially a day or two. However, it is important to stress that these days, technological advance means that it's feasible and it's actually cheaper and more effective to undertake many of these sort of operations that were previously done using fixed-wing planes, using small unmanned electric airborne vehicles, and these have little more noise and amenity impact than a small consumer drone. Now, moving deeper into the exploration phase, especially the latter stages, if some economic deposit of interest has been found, drilling can be used and eventually may be likely to be used. Now, the noise generated by a drilling program depends on the technique. Percussion drilling techniques, for example, they're quite noisy because they're using a hammer drill, and that's quite a noisy technique. And that is almost never undertaken anywhere near people's houses because people just wouldn't put up with that sort of noise. They wouldn't accommodate it. But in contrast, diamond drilling and related drill coring techniques, they typically produce considerably less noise than a truck passing on a nearby road. And these techniques are already very common in the goldfields of Western and Central Victoria and in Eastern Victoria, including in areas in and adjacent to quite large urban centres like Ballarat or Castlemaine, for example. And in instances like that, or Stawell especially, it's become common practice to control the sound and amenity impacts of things like a mineral exploration drilling setup by housing the drill rig and associated infrastructure in a prefabricated and reusable sound controlled enclosure. And the sound levels measured outside of those sorts of systems range into normal background levels as well. So these days it is possible to do most mineral exploration activity with limited sound impacts to adjacent landowners. Obviously, if someone was going to explore right next to someone's house, that would only be done in agreement with that land homeowner.
Thanks, Ross. And in response to the second part of that question, how close to homes are you allowed to operate? 100 metres is the answer to that one. The next couple sit with me. So this one around what rights do private landholders have if an exploration licence is granted over their land, and can you explain the process whereby a landholder or farmer can prevent a mining company from accessing their land and who is responsible for the costs involved? So this is one that comes up quite often when we talk about minerals exploration. In Victoria, like it is in all other states in Australia, the Crown owns the minerals on behalf of all the people. Now, an Act of Parliament, which Laura has made reference to earlier in her presentation, the Mineral Resources Sustainable Development Act, or what we often call for short the MRSDA, gives the government the right to grant licences to companies to search for minerals, and they can generally undertake that search on both Crown land and on freehold land. Now, the MRSDA allows access to freehold land for exploration activity with the prior consent of the landholder and or occupier, and that includes compensation arrangements if that's applicable. Now, if agreement can't be reached, landholders and exploration companies can seek mediation through the mining warden. However, if that doesn't achieve an outcome and the landholder still doesn't provide consent or an appropriate amount of compensation can't be agreed, then either party may refer the matter to the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal or the Supreme Court. Now, there's an important point to stress here around the determination or the ruling that VCAT or the Supreme Court makes in this instance, and that is that they will only determine how much compensation you are entitled to, not whether the licensee actually has the right to search for minerals on your property. Once VCAT or the Supreme Court has made that determination in terms of compensation, the explorer is eligible to take exploration on the landholder's property. So it's really important to stress there that it's important to stress there that where the prevention of a landholder, the ability of a landholder to prevent a mining company from accessing their land, if it does get to the VCAT, VCAT or the Supreme Court will only rule on compensation, not on access. That is considered as a given. So there isn't actually a process whereby a farmer or a landholder can prevent, if it does get to VCAT, an explorer from accessing their property. It's also worth stressing there that minerals exploration is generally quite flexible in the sense that explorers are often open to changing or amending their exploration targets if there's a particular part of a property that an individual or a landholder doesn't want them to access. And it's really about that land access consent and having those open discussions with the explorer about what their intentions are and where they're looking to access. In most cases, an outcome that's mutually beneficial to both parties is able to be arrived at. So I guess it's really encouraging you to have those open and frank and honest conversations with a view to arriving at an outcome that works for both parties. And I should stress that on the compensation point, that doesn't have to necessarily just be financial. That can certainly be in kind. And there's been instances where exploration companies have pushed in tracks or erected fencing or other sorts of activities on agricultural properties. In terms of who's responsible for the legal costs involved, we'd always encourage landholders to seek their own legal advice on these matters, but the normal cost rules would apply, which would be that ordinarily each member would bear their own costs, but ultimately that is a matter for the member presiding over the matter to make a ruling on if it does get to this point. Next one's also with me in terms of the job opportunities and additional industry that will be created through the project proceeding. Now, the job numbers and economic benefits associated with minerals exploration are much lower than mining, and in fact most of the economic benefit that's associated with minerals exploration comes in the form of spending within the region on goods and services, and that's on things such as fuel, accommodation, repairs at local mechanics, and so on and so forth. If we look at the RemPlan economic spending data, which is a data analytics agency that for the last financial year, spending on minerals exploration across northeast Victorian local government areas was 3.74 million, but that was all concentrated within the Mansfield, Wangaratta and Wodonga local government areas. So where you really see the significant job and economic benefits and job creation is if an exploration project or an exploration activity does discover a commercially or economically viable deposit, and that proceeds through to mining. Next one is with you, Laura. Will there be any chance of effects on water quality, either underground or surface water?
Sure. So, I mean, there's, from the sort of practical perspective, you've heard from Ross in terms of the geology that is unlikely from a practical perspective, but definitely from a regulatory perspective, there are significant safeguards around protecting both groundwater and surface water. So the Code of Practice for Mineral Exploration, again, that I referenced before, provides guidance about obligations around minimising risks, including to groundwater. And this includes reference to environmental standards. So that would include the State Environment Protection Policies, Water for Victoria. Now, where exploration work includes activities that don't meet the definition of low impact, so that means a work plan needs to be submitted to the department. That might include, for example, if there's ground intrusive work within 200 metres of a waterway or use of heavy earth moving equipment. Now, as I identified before in my presentation, that work plan must identify the hazards and the risks, which would include any impacts on surface and groundwater, and then they must include a risk management plan that outlines how they're going to eliminate or reduce those risks as far as reasonably practicable. Now, work plans, as I said, they are referred to the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, catchment management authorities, water authorities, etc. in those cases. So they would have input to those work plans on whether any conditions were required, or indeed whether the work plan shouldn't be approved.
Thanks, Laura. And the last one we've got of the, I think there might be two more of the pre-registration questions, then we will get to some of them in the chat. Apologies, we have gone a bit over time, but we are going to continue to work through some of these questions for those of you that can stay on board, and it looks like most of you still are online, so thanks for staying with us. Laura, to what extent are mining companies permitted to explore or mine on or under state or national parkland?
Yep, so currently there's no opportunity to explore in those areas. So there's only a very small number of pre-existing licenses. So if a license was granted before somewhere was made a national park or a state park, those licenses can continue. And there are a number of those across the state, but they are usually very small operations. So otherwise, they're not allowed.
Thanks, Laura. And thank you. And the last of the pre-registration questions is to do with rehabilitation. What steps has Earth Resources Regulation taken to address the criticisms of monitoring and enforcement of rehabilitation activities made in the Victorian Auditor General's Office report Rehabilitating Mines of last year? Is there a comparative data? If there is comparative data showing the difference in performance of monitoring and enforcement of rehabilitation activities, what does that show?
Thanks. So yeah, many of the issues that are facing mines and quarries sites about rehabilitation do have a long history. So in 2018, Earth Resources Regulation initiated a program to improve regulation of rehabilitation at sites following a self-initiated audit. So that program is being delivered through a strategy called the Regulatory Practice Strategy for Rehabilitation of Earth Resource Sites, and that's available on the website, which we'll send you links to after. But this includes a whole range of actions, which include developing a modern policy framework, updating the bond calculator, and requiring operators of key sites to complete site rehabilitation. Now, last year, in 2020, the Victorian Auditor General's Office, or VAGO, they confirmed the issues and improvements that had been identified by Earth Resources Regulation, and they did recognise that it had already taken some serious and considerable steps towards starting to improve the way that it regulates mine and quarry rehabilitation. So Earth Resources Regulation has welcomed that VAGO report and recommendations, and as a result we have further bolstered our regulatory practice strategy, and there's a whole range of additional actions that we are committed to delivering. So the full list, you can have a look at that. It's on the VAGO website, and it's also on the Earth Resources Regulation website. Now, part of that includes a progress report, so we're publishing regular progress reports in terms of those actions and how we're tracking against that, and that will include information about our compliance program. So the annual compliance program for inspections and audits in the 2020-21 financial year has included progressive and final rehabilitation, but in line with the strategy and the actions, that will be stepping that up, and there will be an increased focus on rehabilitation in the next financial year. Now, ERR field activities, or Earth Resources Regulation, the field activities were restricted last year as part of the whole of government restrictions in relation to COVID. So there were less inspections that happened last year, and that was across the board. But that has now resumed, except for the last few days that we were all affected by. But in relation to exploration work in particular, Earth Resources Regulation site visits arise in a number of different ways. So the first one is that there's a work plan being applied for. So there'll be usually an initial site meeting where Earth Resources Regulation will attend along with other departments and agencies, and they'll provide advice to the applicant on the risks and issues that need to be addressed in the work plan. And that's based on the site location, its characteristics, etc. And obviously the relevant laws. But also the compliance team will attend if there are community complaints. So we do have examples of this. So if these occur, when work is happening on the ground, the compliance team will go and do an inspection. And the other key time in terms of exploration activity when Earth Resources might undertake a site visit is in relation to whether to return a rehabilitation bond. So one of the things that must be in place before any ground intrusive work happens is that a rehabilitation bond needs to be put in place, which effectively guarantees against the work not being done. So in order to get that bond back, there needs to be evidence provided about the fact that the rehabilitation's been completed and usually that will include a site visit as well. So I suppose just the last thing to say about the compliance plan is that it is risk-based, and so it does focus on the potential for higher impacts from activities. So in the large part, that will focus on mining and quarrying activities rather than the exploration phase. And that will include the rehabilitation phase of those mines and quarries. And just to note that the government has provided additional funding to Earth Resources Regulation in this year's budget, which will that was for 21.09 million over 4 years. That will significantly increase our capacity to implement the rehabilitation actions that we're committed to.
Thanks, Laura. So that brings us to the end of some of the questions we received with the registrations. We'll now look to go through some of the ones that we've had coming on the chat. And Ross, I'm going to go to you in the first instance. I think this one came in quite early in your presentation when you made reference to strategic metals, and the question is around what are the strategic metals that were mentioned?
Oh yeah, okay, thanks, Brett. Yep, so there's a few other sort of metals that have been mined in Eastern Victoria in the past. So one of them is a mineral called molybdenite. Another one is a mineral, well, obviously tin. So there was a gold dredge, for example, at El Dorado near Beechworth, and that was mining tin as well as gold. Other minerals that are in the district are silver and antimony. Further afield, so not in the local district we're talking about today, but still in northeastern Victoria, there's geological potential for copper and zinc, and potentially also minerals, newly emerging strategic metals like, for example, tantalum and lithium, the battery metal.
Thanks for that, Ross. Laura, I'm going to come to you next with one around, can you comment on the required reductions in exploration licence and holdings over the life of an EL? Part of this particular person's made the comment that part of the reason for large areas is to allow for required drop-offs in ongoing years, and additional land is sometimes selected in order for areas to drop off. So you're able to just provide some information around that?
Sure. So the Act has requirements around specific dates or anniversary dates on which land needs to be relinquished, which means that effectively the licence area is reduced. So I can't recall the exact numbers at which it happens, but it's something like the 2nd, 5th and 7th anniversary. There are percentages of the licence area that need to be handed back, and which are called relinquished. So that does mean the policy rationale, I guess, as I understand behind that, is meant to be about targeting in on where the exploration activity is going to be focused, and then allowing other explorers to come onto the land where you're no longer focusing your activities. So that's the reason for that.
And I'm going to stay with you, Laura. There's another question, and you may have touched on this, but I might get you to just mention it again. What has to be advertised by an EL applicant and how widely?
Yeah, so there's a range of information which relate to the work program that's being proposed, the location, and a whole heap of information that relates to the content of the licence application. So that there's the advertising guidelines set out exactly what needs to be included, and also things like how big it needs to be, and it needs to include maps so that people can actually see where the application area is. So it does need to be published in a statewide newspaper and also in a locally circulating newspaper for the areas within the application area. So depending on how large the application area is, that might include more than one newspaper.
Fantastic. And I'm going to go one more to you, Laura, before I might tackle a couple. There's a question around objections and the process around that, and appreciate that we can't make comments on specific objections, but in general, can you maybe provide just a bit more information around the grounds on which objections or comments this person's asked particular might result in rejecting an application for a licence, and has a licence ever been refused on the basis of public comment? Now, obviously, we can't talk necessarily about specific examples here, as John has rightly pointed out, but it might be worth, Laura, if you can, just providing a bit more information about the objections process and what comments and objections could potentially result, or if they could result in an application being rejected.
Sure. So the sorts of objections in terms of what they would be made about, or how they're taken into account. The primary thing that we look at is whether they relate to the criteria that the license applicant needs to meet. So there's those criteria that I ran through in terms of fit and proper, the work program, and ability to fund, etc. So those are the primary relevant matters in terms of objections. However, there's also considerations, as we've mentioned earlier, around the environmental safeguards or particular features that need to be protected within the application area. So can lead, for example, to special conditions being included on a licence, is one of the outcomes. Another outcome that I have been aware of has been where there's a smaller area that's granted for the licence than what's been applied for. So there's an ability for the decision maker to say they're going to exclude certain areas because they need to be protected. So I'm not aware, but we will correct this in the written responses, of a refusal as such, but certainly I'm aware of the area being reduced to include particular areas. But another outcome that also I'm aware of having in the past is that applicants have actually withdrawn their application. So sometimes that's an outcome too.
Thanks, Laura. I might just, there's a couple of questions that have come in regards to refusal and whether or not a landholder can refuse access to explorers on their property. And I'll repeat and again the point I made earlier around if you are approached by an explorer that is looking to access your property for minerals exploration activities, you can say no, but the explorer also then has the ability to, if they so wish, to refer the matter to either VCAT or the Supreme Court. And again, stressing that point that VCAT or the Supreme Court don't rule on access, they will only rule on the compensation that's payable to you for the explorer to access your property. And once that ruling has been made and determined, the explorer has the right to access your property to undertake that activity. Now, it's also worth mentioning there that given that and the nature of that, it's worth we would always encourage individuals to have those open conversations with explorers and try and get an outcome that works for both them and for the explorer. If the matter does ultimately get referred to VCAT or the Supreme Court, which we would hope it wouldn't, and that the explorer and the landholder could come to some sort of an agreement, but we do understand that there are some instances where that just doesn't occur. The opportunity for negotiation or to try and come to an agreement with the explorer around some conditions and compensation that may be amenable for or be suitable for you are essentially taken out of your hands and handed over to either VCAT or the Supreme Court. So we would certainly encourage you to have those conversations with the explorer. But in essence, I guess the answer to the question is, can you say no? Well, yes, you can, but the explorer can refer that to VCAT or the Supreme Court, and the ruling will only be made and compensation access is taken as a given. Laura, I'm going to come back to you with one that had come in from, I saw it was maybe Michael. There are a couple from Michael. One was around compliance and monitoring of compliance that I'm just trying to find, that's escaped my gaze here now. Oh, here we go. How are regulation requirements monitored and enforced? What are the consequences resulting from non-compliance? Now, I should just flag here, I appreciate, Laura, you head up the licensing team. There is another unit that sits within ERR that manages and oversights compliance. So I guess maybe if you can maybe respond in some sort of general terms, Laura, around the compliance regime.
Sure. Well, I guess I can speak to in terms of what the breaches, what breaches would result in, and penalties and so forth. So the main thing that must be done is that a licensee must comply with an approved work plan. So if they haven't complied with the work plan, then notices can be issued by the compliance team, which usually will, in the first instance, require remedying what's been done and avoiding it in the future. But if they fail to comply with that notice, there is ability to then issue penalties. So there's penalties of up to 2,500 penalty units, which equates to around $400,000. So there are no specific penalties for breaches, though, in terms of sort of harm, if you like, in the same way that would occur under the Environment Protection Act. But of course, those obligations also do apply to these sites. So there can be other agencies that will take compliance action as well.
Thanks, Laura. Thank you. There was a question around, is the landowner entitled to a percentage of any of the value of gold if mined on the property? The answer to that one is, unlike in potentially other states, particularly in the US, where the landholder does have some ownership rights to the minerals below their property. That's not the case in Victoria. Mineral resources are owned by the Crown, and if it does proceed to a mining operation, a royalty is paid to the Crown for gold. Laura, do you know, just I might bring you in here, how far down that extends in terms of the ownership of the Crown?
Well, the ownership of minerals is absolute by the Crown. There are different provisions that apply in terms of depth limits for Crown land, but that's a just different thing to the minerals themselves, which are owned by the Crown.
Thank you. And a question around enforcement of around rehabilitation and the rehabilitation obligations for a miner. Michael's asked, what is the extent of the rehabilitation obligations for a miner? For instance, if mining work introduces pests or weeds or removes apex predators from a region, then the environmental impact may extend well beyond the area of the exploration or mining licence. Where does their liability end?
So in terms of the rehabilitation obligations under our legislation, so the Mineral Resources Act, they do relate to the particular land that's within the licence. So the obligation is to rehabilitate the land either in accordance with the Code of Practice if it's been low impact exploration, or if there's been an approved work plan, then it must be done in accordance with the approved work plan. And that rehabilitation obligation does continue after a licence ceases to exist. So if a licence ends because the term ends or because of another reason, then there is still an obligation on the former licensee to rehabilitate that land, and compliance action can be taken against that. In terms of, I guess the second element to that question was about off-site impacts. That is largely something that would then be dealt with under other legislation. So, for example, the Environment Protection Act, if there's environmental harm or pollution that's occurred, or any other acts around pests and weeds. So, yeah, from our legislation perspective, it does focus on the on-site rehabilitation.
And I'm going to stay with you, Laura. Apologies, you're not getting much of a break from me tonight. So question around how much weight is given to the impact of exploration and drilling on Indigenous flora and fauna. Are new roads allowed to be constructed through otherwise untouched bushland?
So I guess the main thing is that the same native vegetation, flora fauna guarantee, Aboriginal cultural heritage, all of those acts that apply to any activity also apply to minerals exploration. So the same laws apply. So in terms of whether if it's untouched bushland, that would go to the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, and their biodiversity area, and the question would be around whether it meets the native vegetation clearing guidelines, and that includes has its own framework around that in terms of requiring certain types of species cannot be removed or offsets need to be obtained. So they're the same provisions that apply to any clearing that's done for any purpose.
And another question regarding rehabilitation from Ray from the Buckland. Can the Explorer be made to rehabilitate bulldozer damage that they may have created? Laura, I'm going to pass back to you again. Apologies on this one.
Without knowing that it's a specific that question, but yeah, absolutely. If they've created damage, then they're responsible for rehabilitating it.
I note there's a couple of questions in the chat around DART with some quite specific issues highlighted around DART mining. So we might take that one on notice. I think Donna's captured some details there, and we'll follow up with those after tonight's session. I'm just looking through now, and I think we have covered a number of the major questions that have come through tonight. I would stress again that we will provide written responses to both the ones that have been asked tonight and the responses and the questions that came in with the pre-registration. There was a question I noticed around how many people we've had on the call. More than happy to answer that one. It's generally hovered somewhere around the 65 mark for most of the first sort of hour and 10 minutes, and it has dropped a bit since then. We're now sitting at around 42 attendees. I'll stress that and say that I can't actually see who those attendees are. I only see, and all of us that are on this call only see a number. So happy to provide that information. But yeah, we were at sort of 65, 66 for most of the proceedings this evening. We have gone about 28 minutes exactly by my clock over time, so apologies for that. But I do hope that has provided you with a bit more information about minerals exploration in northeast Victoria, and that you are now understand a little bit more about it and have learned something over the course of the last hour and a half, and leave tonight's session knowing a little bit more than you did at 7 p.m. when you joined it. As we bring the session to a close, in terms of the next steps, as I mentioned earlier, a recording of tonight's presentation will be made available online on the Earth Resources website. That's earthresources.vic.gov.au, earthresources.vic.gov.au, along with a transcript of tonight's session. That is probably likely to go up somewhere towards the back end of next week or early the following week once the transcript is completed. So keep an eye out for that, and we'll certainly circulate a link to that once it is available online. We'll also circulate links to a number of other information pages on our website that may be of interest to you. The land access consent tool that I spoke about a little bit earlier, the licenses near me tool that allows you to plug in your address essentially, and it brings up the exploration or other licenses that might be near you, and hopefully you find those useful in providing a bit more information about exploration within the region. That essentially brings tonight's proceedings to a close. I'd just like to say a big thank you to my colleagues, both Laura Hellman and Ross Cayley, for presenting, but also to those that have been involved putting tonight together behind the scenes that you either may not have seen or whose names you may have seen pop up in the chat. I think for all of us, this new format that the last 12 months have sort of imposed on us have been challenging for some. And while we would have loved to have been in the region delivering this session tonight, unfortunately the COVID-19 health advice can make planning for events such as this in person, particularly planning for them in advance, a little bit challenging. But nonetheless, there's just as much effort that goes into making a session like this happen and pulling it all together. So a big thank you to those also that you haven't seen tonight. So that's Mark Farrugia, John Dunleavy, Jason O'Sullivan, Michelle Nunn, and particularly to Donna Mongan, who've all worked tirelessly over the course of the last couple of weeks to make this event happen. That's it from us. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evenings, and at 8:30 we will bid you all good night, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Brett, and cheers everyone.
Thanks, bye.